Welcome to the Biblical Leadership at Work podcast. I am your host, Jason Woodard. Today, we will meet Dr. Jerry Zandstra. Dr. Zandstra has several decades of leadership experience, is a highly educated theologian, a serial entrepreneur, and currently serves as a pastor and as a business leader. On today's episode, he and I will discuss the topic of emotional intelligence and why this concept should matter to Christian leaders.
There's a theological underpinning to this idea that we're all created in the image of God, which all of a sudden kind of changes the story. People stop being tools and people become image bearers.
We compare this biblical model to the world's general view on people in business.
Our MBA programs, a lot of our executive leadership programs that many executives go to, still think of and treat people for their utility. It's a utilitarian perspective. I value you based on what value you bring back to me. I don't value you for yourself.
Dr. Zandstra and I also discuss the importance and potential pitfalls of personality profiles. He also gives some very practical advice to those who are just beginning their leadership journey.
Listen, and ask questions. And ask questions like not what did you decide, but why did you decide that? What motivated you to make that decision?
So now let's meet Dr. Zandstra. Thank you so much for being on today. I'm super excited to talk to you and have our audience get to know you and learn about the topic today of emotional intelligence and leadership in general. So thank you, brother, for joining me.
Oh, happy to, Jason. Thanks for having me on.
So let's get started. Let's talk about your background, like educational, work background. Let people get to know you.
All right. It's pretty varied. My educational background is a bachelor's degree focusing in psychology, a master's degree in divinity, a second master's degree in historical theology, a doctorate in administration from Trinity, TEDS. Some people know that Trinity is TEDS. And then a second doctorate, a PhD from Western Michigan University in public finance and public administration. So yes, I'm a little bit of a nerd.
You
I went
love
to school for a long time. I did. I got to the end of it, and my wife said, "We're done, right?" I said, "Well, what do you think about law school?" She said, "Do you want to be a lawyer?" I said, "No, I just want to understand the law better." She said, "Go buy some books."
Oh, I love it.
You can be self-taught. So that ended the education. Plus, I think at that point, two of my boys were in high school and I was still completing things. So it might have been time to wrap it up.
One thing, Jerry, that I'll say, and I want people to understand this, I did all of my education as a working adult, eventually as a parent, as a professional, as a manager of an operation. And so I think your story debunks maybe a myth that people tell themselves that are working adults with family and their busy lives that I can't go back to school. So yes, you can.
No, we did it. Yeah, there was a period of time in my life when I was carrying a full-time academic load in a PhD program, working for a think tank, traveling more than 100,000 miles a year, flying all over the world, and being back in time to preach on Sunday.
Yeah.
So you can figure it out. You can get it done. School flipped for me when I started thinking about it like a job. It's just a series of tasks. That's all.
Yeah.
And you find time to complete the tasks. And after a certain prescribed amount of time, they hand you a piece of paper and you're done and you can call it quits or you can go do something else. So that's my background. My professional career is sort of all over the place. I have started and owned a number of companies from property development to a restaurant. I was in the film industry for a while, produced a movie, started a company about 12 years ago called University. We eventually merged with another company and rebranded, new name, that develops learning and training for some of the largest companies in the world. So we develop e-learning, we develop augmented reality, virtual reality, all sorts of cool learning experiences. That's what our company does. And that company has grown nicely. So that's what I do every day. That's what I do going into an office. And then I have been an ordained pastor now this is year 32.
Wow. What denomination are you ordained in, Jerry?
Christian Reformed.
Okay. All right.
So I was ordained. I had to do the math there. I was ordained in 1991. I have consistently served the church. So if you sort of peeled back all the other stuff and got to the core, at the end of the day, my profession is I'm a pastor. And so that's always I've done a lot of other things in business, but my faith has always been core, and that's my opportunity to serve the church. And so I continue to preach every Sunday. I don't have a lot of other responsibilities at the church, but I do continue to preach.
All right. So you still are active preaching full time.
I am.
What was the movie? What movie did you get involved in?
The movie was called The Genesis Code. It was a story of a young man struggling with his faith and how he eventually comes to his faith through a series of personal crisis points. So that's, yeah.
Okay. People find that, can they stream it somewhere and check it out?
I should know the answer to that. I didn't just produce it. I'm actually in it.
Oh my goodness.
So it's something, I'm the third lead in the movie, which was something one of my partners thought was a good idea. I wasn't sure about it. That's my last acting gig. It's just a weird environment. You can find it, the Genesis Code.
I'll link to it in the show notes, so if people want to check it out, because now I want to check it out. I think it seems like I remember you telling me back when you and I first met. You were a professor, so people know. Jerry was one of my professors in my MBA at Cornerstone University. Yeah, so
I think I taught there. I taught economics and global business probably for 12 years. There's some stuff I'm leaving out of the story because otherwise it just looks like I have a significant case of ADD, which I probably do. Career ADD, but I just find stuff interesting and
go do it.
And it turns out, so that's what happens.
So as we discussed, and this podcast was developed to talk to Christian leaders in the secular work environment, people that are going into different jobs every day who love Christ and are serious about being great leaders for his glory and to be effective in the workplace. And today I wanted to talk to you about the idea of emotional intelligence and even further other leadership topics. I know that that's an area that you've studied very deeply, but I know that specific topic was one that you taught in the class that I sat under your leadership in many, many years ago. And I've even to now not forgotten about those times when I was learning and the impact it had on me. And I just think that's a fascinating topic. And I think it's one that's not discussed a lot and it's impactful. So can you talk a little bit about the idea of emotional intelligence and why we should care about it and why we should understand it?
Yeah, it's an interesting concept. It was sort of first named in the 60s. It was a book, I believe the title was Emotional Intelligence. And it was sort of trying to counterbalance this idea of IQ. And rather than just looking at people as far as what are their innate abilities to think and to reason, life is not all about reason. Life is not all about being rational, obviously. If it were, we would all be Spock, right, from Star Trek, and
Great
we're not.
example. Yeah.
We are not all that logical. We are emotional creatures. And, the connection to our faith is that that's exactly the way God created us. God is also not pure reason or rationale. Read the Old Testament, right? God is sad. God is angry. God is joyful. Mm-hmm. And so part of our image-bearing capacity, part of our mirroring God is our emotional state. So there's a theological underpinning to this idea that we're all created in the image of God, which all of a sudden kind of changes the story. People stop being tools and people become image bearers. And oh my goodness, when you realize that C.S. Lewis put it well, every person you've ever met, every single person is created in the image of God, bears the image of God. From the very worst person to the very best person, to people in their lowest moments of agony and maybe in the final moments of their lives to the most joyful time, every single person, and I'm not going to get the quote right, C.S. Lewis's statement is something like, you have never met a mere mortal.
Right. Yep.
And, every person you fight with, you argue with, you do business with, you fall in love with, every person is an image bearer of God and lives into eternity. They are eternal joys or eternal horrors, but they are eternal going forward, not going backwards, but going forward. And that's a remarkable way to think. And then, connecting emotional intelligence to the biblical narrative. I happen to be preaching through some Proverbs right now. If you want to understand emotional intelligence, read some Proverbs. You will find the concepts of emotional intelligence all over the place. You can go read Aristotle. You'll find the very same concepts. And the concept, I would argue, in classical theology and classical philosophy is wisdom. It's the ability to read the room, right? And so emotional intelligence isn't how well I can perform perhaps on a complicated math or a language test. It's how well do I interact with other human beings?
Yeah. How can I connect with them, right? Connect and relate to them.
How can I be empathetic? How can I listen intently? Am I a caring person? And, some people say, well, emotional intelligence is just a term for people whose IQs aren't very high, to give them some. Okay, fine. Some of the highest IQ people I've ever met, and I had the joy to work. I have had the joy to work with some just crazy smart people, just crazy smart. The things that they can think of, or the way they can take a business problem and think of it in a new way or develop a new solution. Crazy smart, or wildly financially successful. They've run companies, but they have terrible emotional intelligence. Some of the people in graduate schools that I attended, some of the smartest people on the IQ scale, some of the least emotionally intelligent people I've ever met. Again, if we use biblical terms, we would call them fools. And so that difference between wisdom and foolishness isn't just pure academics. It's how do you relate to somebody? Do you understand how people see you? Can you look at yourself through their eyes? Can you enter into their situation? Can you be empathetic? Or do you just whistle through life? I mean, that's what the opposite of this. Sometimes it's really helpful if you're trying to understand a thing to think of its opposite, right? The opposite of this is narcissism.
Yeah. Complete ignorance of, like, no self-awareness whatsoever.
No self-awareness, none. And so, on a narcissist on an intelligence, on an IQ scale might be super high, but on an EQ scale would get a 0. And our world is, unfortunately, has a lot of narcissists in it.
Question I have, Jerry, on that topic. So I have experienced in my career, and this is my experience, is that when you work with extremely technical people, generally, they have less, I'm going to just say less social skills, or they don't come as natural to them. And again, this is general. I've had some people I've been blessed to work with that were extremely technical and very high, what I would call emotional intelligence, very high level of, self-awareness. And it's a very powerful combination in business and in my field that I work in. But can somebody who isn't very strong in self-awareness and emotional intelligence, but a believer, let's say this is someone who's a believer, can they get better at it? Can they learn? Can they grow in that area? Or is it, IQ is it's what we're given, I think. Aptitude. I mean, there's a certain level of aptitude that I have.
Largely fixed.
Yeah, it's exactly. Largely fixed. It's the same or not the same with emotional intelligence. And if it's not fixed, like, how can people develop that? Because they should, as leaders, we should, especially as Christian leaders, to be able to understand, as you said, that we're working with people made in the image of God, and not to be able to want to understand them better and want to relate to them better.
Yeah. Your point, in different positions I've been in, I've worked with a lot of engineers, and, my youngest son is an engineer. They tend to have high IQs. They tend to have low EQs. Now, part of that might be because their training, their college, their education, they aren't taking many speech classes. They aren't taking, intro to psychology. There's so much technical stuff to be done. And my son and many other engineers understand the world in a technical way, right? Life to them looks like a spreadsheet, and I have a bit of that in me. Things on spreadsheets make sense to me.
Yeah.
And so that is a natural tendency. I don't believe it's fixed. There are some people who seem to have softer hearts and are more empathetic. But I think if you dug into that, most of the time, you would find that that's mostly nurture. You would find that they were raised by people who were wonderfully empathetic and wise. They were surrounded by that biblical expression, surrounded by a cloud of witnesses who live it out. And I can't tell you where I'm at on the emotional intelligence scale. I hope that in my role as a pastor and as a business leader, I hope that I'm fairly high. But I was profoundly influenced by people. My father was very empathetic and listened carefully. My grandparents were just attracted people. That's a way you can tell. Yeah. If you wonder whether or not you have a high EQ, if people seek you out and are seeking from you a listening ear or a different perspective or, a shoulder to cry on, then, and that happens to you, you have a high EQ. That's a highly attractive because our world values IQ much higher than it values EQ. Our culture does, but individuals don't.
Yeah, that's a good point.
A single individual, especially one that's hurting or lonely or damaged or struggling, they're not seeking the smartest people in the room. They're seeking the most empathetic people in the room or the wisest person in the room. And those two things are not necessarily the same thing. And that's, like I say, there's a lot of literature on EQ versus IQ, but I think practically we all know it. Pick some world-renowned geniuses, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Steve Jobs. Let's go with those three.
Yeah. Yep.
If you had a highly technical problem, you would go talk to them. If you were struggling with depression or having troubles in your marriage or had just lost your spouse,
you would not go talk to them.
Probably not.
No.
Right. Probably not. And not to say that they're bad men. I've never met any of them. We see that, we live that every day. And I think as individuals, we highly value people who are emotionally intelligent. And then you think about how that translates over to the work environment, right? And it depends on the size of the company, but there are people in many companies who are highly technical. Everybody appreciates them for their expertise, but not necessarily in their leadership position. And I've seen this in a number of cases. Very, very technically smart people come up with something cool. They start a company and they realize they are absolutely unable to run that. I shouldn't say run it, to lead it.
Yeah.
They can't lead it. And so they end up shifting over to chief technology officer or something like that because it might be a struggle in their finances and, leading the financial side of the company. But more often, people go to them for the smart technical solution, but they're leaders in technology, but they fumble the ball when it comes to understanding people. We can put it in fairly crass terms and say they get an F on the HR function. Smartest person in the room, but nope, not going to work.
Yep. I will say, just to share some of my career experience, I began at leadership and really came up through an industry where results were essentially, I want to say not all that mattered, but they were kind of all that mattered, right? I developed a reputation early in my career of being able to get things done, but leave a trail of dead bodies in my wake. And it wasn't purposeful. It was, what I found to make me successful. It was, it was the automotive manufacturing industry. It's pretty intense. It's pretty low margin. There's not a lot of time to just take time and get to know people. And honestly, some of my early career mentors that wasn't a focus area. Now, again, I don't want to paint a picture of it was, anti-people. And, there's still people that I cared for and loved and prayed with even at work. But God led me to a different company in a different industry, but a company that was really focused on people development, people leadership. Results were important. We had to make money, but it was a tremendous shock. Like literally my world was turned upside down. And I went into that company being asked by those that hired me to implement change, to drive results. And so I just did what I normally did. And all of a sudden I had like a mutiny on my hands with the people I was leading, and I didn't understand it. Right. And fortunately, I was connected with a mentor who was still just somebody that I think so highly of, that had worked there for many years, who had came out of the military, but had adapted well to that type of a culture. And started to understand the importance of people and the importance of people development.
Sure.
And at the same time, I began my classes at Cornerstone, which again, I think Cornerstone's graduate program did a really good job of helping us to integrate our faith and work more than maybe I had previously. And so that was a whole 4-year period that for me, when I talk about, at least in my experience, God put some things in my life that allowed me to become far better on the emotional intelligence spectrum. And it was hard. It was painful. It was really hard.
It wasn't what you were taught. I'd recommend to your listeners a book called Everybody Matters, written by a friend of mine, Bob Chapman. Bob's company is $3+ billion, privately owned, probably somewhere between 12 and 13,000 employees. He's had more than 100 successful acquisitions. He went to school, he learned accounting, and he came into his dad's business. His father died from a heart attack, and suddenly this guy in his early 30s is responsible for, it wasn't nearly as big then as it is now, but, and he said, I went to accounting school. I thought of people as pieces on a chessboard.
Yeah.
I just moved them around. And he's a Christian. Bob's Anglican in background, Episcopalian. And he had like a people conversion. And here's where you should read his book. And the book, tells you all you need to know. Everybody Matters.
Everybody Matters. We'll link that in show notes so people can find it.
That's a great book. But Bob's conversion to a higher plane of emotional intelligence happened at a wedding. So he's sitting there, he's watching the father of the bride walk the bride down, and they get to the end, and he says, the priest or pastor or whatever says, who gives this woman to this man. And it dawns on Bob all of a sudden. He's like, I know what he's saying, his mother and I, or her mother and I, but I know what the father is saying. The father of the bride is saying, look, young man, her mother and I poured our life into this young woman, and now the two of you are going to have a life together. But there are some expectations that we have that you're going to treat her well. And Bob said, I'm sitting there thinking about that. I'm getting a little emotional about it. And all of a sudden it occurs to me that I have 10,000 people working for me that have done the very same thing. They have parents. They give this huge chunk of their life. And so out of that, Bob started building courses on empathetic listening and put thousands of people through it, his employees. Then he developed a nonprofit where they do it for police officers and firefighters and school teachers, and teaching people to be empathetic. And I'll give you an example. I was visiting his company in St. Louis, just outside of St. Louis. And I wasn't there to meet with him. I was there to meet with some of his leaders. And I didn't even know he was in the building. He's all over the world. So I go walking past his office, and he's sitting in there, and he sees me. I think he's on the phone, and he sees me and he waves me in, and he goes, "Oh, I got to go. There's somebody I got to talk to." He hangs up, and I said, Bob, I didn't mean to interrupt. I didn't even know you were here. He goes, No, sit down. I said, Bob, you run this huge company. You don't have to take the time for me. You really don't. And it was the coolest thing. He closed his laptop, and he stood up because I was still standing, and he said, right now, you are the most important person in the world. Now, please have a seat and spend a little time with me.
Wow.
And it was such a simple thing. And I thought, and he still serves as a coach to me in many, many ways. I talked to him in the last few weeks, actually. When I have something I'm struggling with, or I'm not sure what to do. So how do you become emotionally intelligent? I think connecting with people who are.
Yeah. Learning from them, right?
Yeah. And you're already aware of, most everybody that's listening is already aware of the emotionally intelligent people in their lives. Almost everybody has emotionally intelligent people, at least one. Go find them, identify with them, learn from them. So your initial question was, can you grow EQ? Of course you can grow EQ, just like you can grow in wisdom. Wisdom is not, people aren't just born with a certain, sized bucket of wisdom. You grow that in time and experience, and more importantly, reflection.
Yeah.
Reflection is a great way to do it. I'll think of all the interactions I had in a particular day. Where was I displaying high levels of emotional intelligence? I don't think this formally, but where, and then you go, well, I just blew that one. I didn't give that person the time they clearly needed it, and I was busy and I failed.
And thankfully, going back to the wisdom piece, God's word tells us that if we want more, he'll give it. Yeah. We just ask for it. He will give liberally of wisdom.
Yeah. And again, read Proverbs. I mean, my goodness, if you ever want a textbook on how to be emotionally intelligent and how to be wise, it's right there.
Yeah, it's full of it. Jerry, so just in a general question for you on leadership. Again, I really respect your thoughts on that topic, and as a leader yourself, what do you think is just a big gap in leadership in general right now in the world that's having the most detrimental impact on things?
I would go right straight back to C.S. Lewis. I still think that our MBA programs, a lot of our executive leadership programs that many executives go to, still think of and treat people for their utility. It's a utilitarian perspective. I value you based on what value you bring back to me. I don't value you for yourself. And the message of the gospel, right, is so powerful to that. That's what's so attractive about the life of Christ, right? That you would be born for me, you would live for me, you would die for me, you would be resurrected for me. Man, what a thing.
Yeah, amazing grace. Amazing grace.
I'm worth all of that. It's a very countercultural message. I think Christianity lived out is highly revolutionary. In the world of business, in the world of politics, and in the world of some nonprofits even, people become means to an end. It's utilitarianism. Yeah. The message of the gospel, the message again of Bob's wonderful book, Everybody Matters, is a really simple way of saying what C.S. Lewis says. Everybody matters. Yep. Every person matters. And C.S. Lewis gives it a little more context, but I think that's the thing that we're missing. You go back to, some of the roots of this thinking is in project management, and especially in your industry, in manufacturing, in my industry, project management is a big deal. But you are looking at pieces of things, and people become pieces of things.
Yeah, they're part of the process. They're just part of the process.
Yeah, human resources, right?
Yeah.
Think of what head count. People get fired. People get terminated. Bob points out language like that all the time. More things I've appreciated about him is you don't take somebody out in the parking lot and shoot them. You're not the Terminator. We have horrible language built around business. And much of that is the intellectual background of that. Some of that stuff is from Frederick Taylor and Taylorism and the idea of managing people as machines.
Yeah, they're just part of the cost structure, right?
Yeah, one of my friends, guy was a nuclear sub-captain, wrote a book, David Marquet. David says, for most of the Industrial Revolution, in the ideal situation, you could just chop the heads off all of your workers. You don't need them to think. You need them to just do. Yeah, they're robots.
Yep.
Right. And when they start thinking, bad things happen. And he said that's how the military was run for a while. That's how most large corporations were run for a while. It's how General Electric was run. Jack Welch ran things that way. And people were robots and disposable.
Disposable assets.
Yeah. And in that situation, the opposite of Bob's book, nobody matters.
Yeah.
I matter, but you don't.
You don't. Yeah. I heard somebody say one time that people are our only appreciating asset. And I thought that was really insightful, right? They are our asset. They're an asset to the company if you want to look at it like
Absolutely.
that. But they are appreciating, and we should be investing in them, not only training, but just their development and nurturing, even if I could use that word. What you were talking about earlier with utilitarianism, it makes me think of a story I'll share that was a huge encouragement to me. And this was, I guess, a time when I was getting something right. And there's been many times I don't. So I don't want it to come off as, I'm just completely successful in every situation. But I had come to a new team as a leader, manager. And I'd been there for a little while, maybe months, call it 90 days, 60 days. And I had one of the employees and I were talking, we're having a one-to-one. And he was a younger guy and had, I think, spent a big chunk of his career at this organization under the prior leader. And he just was sharing with me that he was really surprised at how a change in one person in that role could make such a positive impact to the culture and to how people behaved out on the shop floor. And that he always felt like before he didn't use the term utilitarian, that type of term, but he said you're just being used as it's a disposable asset. And he goes, it's different now. And he said, I've never experienced that. And he was just kind of reflecting on the impact that had. And, it gave me a chance too, to share with him that I manage and I lead the way I do in large measure because of my faith.
Yeah.
As a Christian, that I believe that all people are made in God's image and they should be treated with dignity and care and respect. And I've said, and I've had other people on my podcast share times, even when you have to terminate, and we'll use that term, when you have to let somebody go from the team, to do that in a caring and loving way, because again, they're humans, they're made in God's image, and they're going through one of life's most traumatic events, aside from the death of a loved one. And, we should be sensitive to that. So
yeah,
it's revolutionary.
That's the time it most matters, is in the hard things. And it is. I mean, if you've ever really been in the presence of somebody who's incredibly gracious, sometimes we think people that are very gracious, that are very emotionally intelligent, might not be all that bright or might not be all that tough, right? To be in business, you need to be tough. There's just things you need to take, and there's deferred and delayed gratification. You take risks. There's an enormous amount, especially people in leadership positions. But that doesn't mean necessarily that you have to be robotic in how you treat people. And so you get that combination of somebody who is highly knowledgeable or technical, highly skilled, let's say, very bright, in tandem with empathy and passion and compassion. That is a remarkable person. That person will leave a mark on your soul.
Yeah.
Because you will be, and again, I mean, lots of people are in marriages where you're not listening to each other. You're not being emotionally intelligent with each other. You're treating each other like utilities. Lots of people are friends that way. You're useful to me as a friend if it's all done in cost-benefit analysis. And cost-benefit analysis is absolutely vitally important to running and leading and organizing a firm, a business. But who really wants to work there?
Yeah.
Who wants those things to be? I don't mean to diminish them. They are essential. If your company's not making money, being the most caring person in the world is actually not being caring at all.
Yeah.
You have to make sure that in the corporate setting or business setting, that the company is economically viable, because you could be the nicest person in the world, but all those people are going to lose their jobs anyway. So that's not a solution. But being successful and being ruthless they're honored in our culture. They really are. And
well, you go back to the example you gave earlier, Elon Musk, and I don't personally know the man, but I have read his biography, and it's pretty intense, pretty ruthless. He's successful as you look at financially and, running multiple businesses and multi-billionaire. But I could remember reading, it was a team of leaders in an organization that I was at, and the CEO, we met once a year as a really global leadership team, and would always read a book ahead of time to come and talk about. And one year it was his biography. And I can remember going to the meeting, and CEO asked, there's probably 40 of us in the room, let's talk about the book. And I said, you know what? He's accomplished a lot of pretty cool things. He's obviously a wicked smart engineer, but I'm not comfortable at all with his leadership style, and I don't think I would ever, condone leading like that. And I definitely got a little bit of a raised eyebrow from our CEO. I think maybe he held up, Elon Musk's approach with leading people a little higher. Again,
successful, brilliant in business, successful, brilliant in life. Steve Jobs, same thing. I mean, read Isaacson's book on Steve Jobs and ask yourself at the end, would you like to be him?
Yeah.
And if you say yes, then ask yourself, would you like your child to be like him?
Yeah. Yeah.
In their personal life? Probably not.
Right. Yeah.
And again, there are people that are wildly, Bob Chapman is one of them. There are people that are financially just crazy successful, but they have not lost sight of that important human element that makes them human beings. And those two things are not mutually exclusive. So to your question of how do you learn this? How do you do this? I've learned an awful lot I read a lot of biographies. And I read a lot of history just to understand what makes people tick. And it's not just that, it's also sort of to help me understand what makes me tick. So the reflection, the reading, the research, modeling, finding a person in your life who has those skills. All those things can increase your emotional intelligence. And, Jason, right, this is a fairly standard question. What do you want written on your tombstone?
Yeah.
This guy was an idiot, but boy, was he good at growing companies. Yeah. You good with that?
I ask everybody that I interview, Jerry, I ask at the end of the podcast, I ask, what do you hope to leave as a legacy when you retire, when you're done? Yeah. What do you want people to remember about you? And again, I'm interviewing believers, workplace believers, and all of them talk about the impact on people, not the profit margins, not the cash flow, right? Because as Christians, that's what we have to leave a legacy of honoring Christ, of pointing to his glory. And it's how we handle people. And certainly we need to do our work well. As you said earlier, the businesses are
absolutely
profit generating, wealth generating. They bring wealth to our world and, bring benefits and the way that our lifestyles, they're essential. So hey, another topic I'd like to talk briefly about that I know that you're passionate about, I am, it was super helpful to me, is, and you said a minute ago about understanding yourself as leaders. I think it's really very important. Leaders have to be able to understand their own shortcomings, their own strengths. And one of the tools, probably the best tool that I've ever encountered, was the DISC profile. And I know there's other tools out there that are, I would say, effective. But the DISC is a big one. I think when I was in your class, we talked about the DISC and how that can help you. Could you talk a little bit about that personality profile tool and the importance of those types of things?
DISC is, DISC is useful. Enneagram is useful. What you're learning there, and I have some criticisms of those tools too, because people tend to learn, on the Enneagram, I'm a 7 or whatever, right? And you use that to justify bad behavior.
Yeah, it's just the way I am.
It's just how I'm wired. I'm a 7. Of course, I'm an idiot, right? Yeah. Of course, I'm, whatever. And it's useful for gaining insight into your tendencies. And, tendencies, if you're a baseball fan, hitters tend to have tendencies, right? They hit ground balls, they hit fly balls, they hit the left field, they hit the right field, they hit with power, they tend to bunt, and the defenses are always adjusting now, which is always fun to watch.
Right. It's predictable.
It's predictable because it's statistically based. It's factually based. I mean, what you're learning about in the DISC or the Enneagram or one of the number of the rest of those is basically the tendencies. Most of those tendencies come with good and bad, right? So the DISC test, you might be a high D, and that can be great until it isn't, because there's some really, really destructive things that, D's or I's or whatever can do. And so it's helpful to understand yourself. Don't let that be your excuse for bad behavior. And don't think of, don't categorize yourself, well, I'm a D, so I'm not empathetic. Baloney. Learn to be empathetic. Don't say, well, that's just, I can't do that. It's a tendency. It's not that you're going to do it every single time.
Yeah. I think that isn't important. And at least it was for me to say, okay, here's my tendencies. Yeah, those match up. And oh, by the way, here's some areas that you need to be mindful of, because these can be destructive and you need to manage those. Yeah. And so to be able to also understand that people with other profiles, you may have to work harder to connect with. And
it's when you start seeing, the Enneagram does that, this does that. When you start seeing the dangers and the interactions between the different types, that gets really interesting, because stuff that is so clear to you. How do you not see this? How are you not comprehending what I'm saying? Well, what I'm saying matches perfectly with my particular personality, or way of world and life view, or way of thinking, or modus operandi. Whereas somebody else coming in from a different point is, you aren't hearing me at all.
Yeah.
So I, like you say, I think that those interactions, I think the first part is self-discovery. It's, it's know thyself. And then you start realizing that you interact with people that are quite different culturally, in language and emotional intelligence and in IQ and certainly in personality types. Yeah. The world's a wonderful, complex place of people. I mean, it's wonderful tapestry.
You never stop learning as a leader, ever. Mm-hmm. You just never stop. I always will remember something, and you drew it on the board one time in class when you were talking about the DISC profile specifically at this time, and you said something that I now have seen in myself over and over again. And you said when stress comes, when the pressure's on, that you will tend to go right back to wherever your natural, for me, I'm a very analytical person. I think it's C. I'm kind of CD.
Yeah.
And boy, when the pressure's on, when things are, I want to see the data. Boy, I'll bury myself in the spreadsheets and analyze the data. And then, which is important for me to also be able to say, okay, when the pressure and stress is on, you're not going to want to go interface with the people and go interact with the people. I want to be lost in the data. And so that pushes me. It helps me push myself out of that comfort zone. I always remember that. It was really insightful, I thought.
Stress is where the water comes down and you see where the rocks are, right?
Yeah, for sure.
That's you see where, and they might be good rocks or bad rocks, but you see them. And I'm completely different. I don't react to stress usually analytically. I just go into takeover mode. I'm just going to completely take this over.
You're a D, right?
Yeah. And I'm just going to dominate this thing and I'm going to fix it and I'm going to push people till it gets fixed. And that's sometimes depends on the situation, in a life and death situation.
It could be okay.
Not a bad thing. In pretty much every other circumstance, that's usually the wrong thing to do.
Yeah. Let it play out. Let's take a step back and let it play out.
So I'm learning. I'm learning to do it.
Hey, one more question for you, and before we wrap up, and then I also want to talk about how people might be able to connect with you. But one other question: I hope part of what this podcast is a help to other leaders, and especially maybe those that are a little younger in their leadership journey. What would you give for advice, Jerry, to a believer who's new to the leadership process? They're learning, maybe they're in their first role as a leader. Just general advice. What would you give them for that?
Listen, and ask questions. And ask questions like not what did you decide, but why did you decide that? From people who are, a little further up the chain in either in title or in age. What motivated you to make that decision? And it's an opportunity that you have to ask questions. That's part of why the biographies matter to me, is I will read them and I'm kind of asking questions of dead people. But I'm trying to, now why did you, what made you decide that was the thing to do in this particular situation? But, if you're somewhere in the middle management stuff, I mean, the opportunity to ask people who are higher up to say, I get what you did there. Can you explain to me why? What were the key factors? That to me is huge. And I've learned it from positive examples and I've learned it via negativa, right? Where you go, that guy's just a disaster.
Yep.
And when you ask them why, the why questions as to why they made destructive decisions, the logic, both IQ and EQ behind it is often really, really faulty. And, so I think understanding why people do what they do and really learning to understand people, if you want to lead well and you want to lead as a believer, you want to lead as a Christian, identifying, those leaders that you can ask questions of, and then treating everybody who reports to you as if they were your brother or sister. Yeah. Maybe even a little better than that.
Yeah, depending on how that relationship is.
Depending on your family, yeah.
I was told one time by somebody I really respected that as even experienced leaders move into new roles, that you should listen, learn, then lead. It's that whole listening and asking questions. And when I've done that well, it's worked out. When I came into a new organization or been placed in a leadership role of a new team, I just ask those questions and get to know people and build those relationships before you start. Just starting to make decisions and take over, just taking over the situation when you don't know.
This is a terrible story. I'm humiliated by it now, but I'm going to tell it anyway. I was part of an organization a number of years ago and I came in arrogant and I fired a bunch of people without really understanding them or what they did. I was trying to send a message. And I did. And the message was, I'm an idiot. That's been 25 years ago, but it's like I was a young man full of myself and full of faith in my own abilities and my own thought processes and my own extremely limited experience. And not only did I make some mistakes, but the harder part of it is I really hurt some people. I really did. And, yeah, I regret it. Listen, think, reflect.
Good. Get a mentor, right? Get a mentor.
Get a mentor. Get somebody who's a few miles ahead of you down the road. That's so good.
Yeah. And that's what my hope, again, this podcast should not be your mentor, but it can come alongside of a mentor. But sir, get a mentor and be a mentor is wide as his advice, I think, for all of us. Jerry, how can people reach out to you? Social media, email, where can they contact you? And
my email is, and you can put this in the show notes too. It's jerry@jerryzandstra.com. Matter of fact, Jason, I think you have it. The email's fine. LinkedIn is fine. Those are probably that email is the one that is it's my own personal one. Yeah. So that's the best. Okay. That's the best way of getting a hold of me. And of course, LinkedIn's always a good option too.
Yeah. Yeah. That's where we've stayed connected as well. Well, hey, brother, it's been a joy. I haven't talked to you in, I think we said today, 10 years. I haven't talked to you. Yeah. You were a huge blessing to me, both as I did my MBA and then we did some work together past that with mentoring and coaching of individuals. And I've always respected you a great deal and how God has gifted you. And I appreciate your time today, and I hope that the audience gets as much out of it as I have. It's been great talking to you again about these things.
Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity just to think together and to think together about our culture and our companies with Christians is something that unfortunately many of us don't have the opportunity to do very much, and. So this is a blessing to me. I appreciate the conversation. Thanks, Jason.
Good. All right, man. Take care, brother.
All right. We'll see you.
And thank each of you for joining us again today. Can you please take just a few minutes to rate our podcast? It helps others to find it, and it provides some useful feedback for us to improve the show. I hope you'll join us again next month as we meet another leader striving to honor Christ in their leadership journey.